Hello, everybody, and welcome to the second episode of the Overly Sarcastic Podcast. Now we have a name, which is really cool. Today we're going to be talking about primarily Machiavelli, how I got interested in this wonderful character, his work The Prince, which you've probably heard of, and his work Discourses on Livy, which you've probably not heard of. So, backstory, when I was in middle school, high school, I was a nerd, and played a little-known video game called Assassin's Creed. And in the second one, you meet a guy named Machiavelli, who's all sneaky and shifty. And in the third one, Brotherhood, you become better friends with him. And at one point, he tells the main character, Ezio, one day I plan to write a book about you. And Ezio says, if you do, make it short. And then he jumps off the building, and I told my dad, is Machiavelli a real guy? And he said, yeah, he wrote a book about being sneaky. And I thought, oh, this book is clearly about Assassin's Creed. I need to get my hands on this. So in my sophomore year of high school, that dates me, when Assassin's Creed Brotherhood came out, I thought, okay, we are reading The Prince. This is a thing that's happening now. So we read an excerpt from it, like 2 or 3 chapters, which, if you've read The Prince, you know is only like 5-10 pages. And I thought, well, this is great. I need to read more of this. So for Christmas, I asked my mom and my dad to get me a copy of The Prince, and they did. So over the break, I read it, and I thought, this is amazing. And then I started reading Discourses on Livy, which is his other most important book. And what I didn't realize is that book requires an immense knowledge of Roman history, which I did not have. But the point is, The Prince is a book about how when you want to get something done, you should just go for it. Don't let petty things like morality constrain you from taking power by means of killing everyone else who's in power before. You're able to do those things. People like to attribute the phrase, the ends justify the means, to Machiavelli, which is a very fair, rough generalization. But if you get into Machiavelli and read The Prince properly, you'll see that it's really a conditional phrase, because what I think a better line to describe his ideas is desperate times call for desperate measures, and only desperate times call for desperate measures. So when he's talking about how in The Prince that a ruler should be crafty, should appear to be one way and really act the other way, should be feared more than loved, and do all these seemingly devious things to gain power, keep power, hold on to it, and maintain an image, and really be doing other things in the background. It seems so mean, but it's for the goal, as he states in the end, of uniting Italy, because he says Italy is sick. Since when the Roman Empire fell apart and all sorts of different kingdoms and republics and whatever splintered out of it, Italy's been in a rough spot, and it would really be better if it was unified, if it was all one thing. And he's saying, even though he's ostensibly writing The Prince for the new Medici guy who just came back into power, he's really writing it for the hope that someone sees it, and not the Medici, because he thought it was a total ass. Funny story about how much Machiavelli would have probably hated the Medicis who were in power, because they're the ones who exiled and tortured him before. The longer version of this is that the Medici family was a banking family that was very prominent and powerful in Florence for quite a while, about 100 or 200 years or so. But Machiavelli served with them, sort of, and they got deposed briefly after Savonarola, a crazy Dominican monk, took over the city and plunged it into darkness for a good year or two. He liked burning books. I hate people who like to burn books. Anyway, Machiavelli was kind of off in the background during that, but when he got kicked out, there was a republic put in instead of the previous form of government that the Medicis presided over, and Machiavelli happily served in the republic because he really likes republics, and we'll get back to that later. But when Machiavelli's beautiful republic he was serving in was torn apart by the Medici who came back, they said, you were on our side, but yet you're serving the Republic. That's bad. So they tortured him and exiled him and kicked him out of the city, and he's writing The Prince from a position of exile in the Tuscan countryside. So his goal, sort of, is saying, hey, I'm giving you advice when new Medici guy comes into power, Lorenzo II. I'm giving you advice, please give me a job, that'd be great. I'm poor, hungry, alone in this stupid little cottage house outside of the city that I love, and I would really like to come back. That's what's going on the surface. But if you've studied The Prince briefly, or know about it offhand, you may be aware of the common interpretation that The Prince is entirely political satire. It's making fun of the extremes that people will go to do seemingly insignificant things like hold on to power, because what does power without anything important attached to it do? We'll get to that later. But the interpretation is that Machiavelli is just kind of taking the piss out of the Medici guy by saying, yes, and you should totally kill everyone in the family of whoever you just deposed in case someone tries to come back, and if you have a choice between killing a man's father or taking their land, you should kill their father because they'll forget about that before they forget about their land, and all these really, really bad things, and it's like he's just making fun of it. That's valid, but not the only way to look at it. Certainly, there are, parts of that interpretation that definitely stand up because he's comparing the ideal prince character to Cesare Borgia at the time, which is like, for our modern audience, comparing Lorenzo II to Cesare Borgia is saying, like, that politician, he's up and coming, he's really like Donald Trump because he really speaks his mind and sticks to his guns. Well, it sounds like a compliment, but if you're being compared to that person in that way for that thing, you're not really going to take it as one, so it's kind of like a backhanded compliment in many ways, and that's a very common way that the prince is viewed, but the other way is to view him as being serious, yes, but not for the reasons you'd think. It's not a selfish reason to hold on to power, it's actually a pretty altruistic reason, that's to save Italy. So if you take a close look at Machiavelli's ideas and his thoughts in the historical context of his time, you'll see that he's really saying that this is a necessary evil that needs to be done for the good goal of uniting Italy. Machiavelli's advice in The Prince is really for the person who he thinks is strong enough to actually go and do those things that need to be done, necessary evils to unite Italy. So, essentially, the prince is a necessary evil. And on the topic of necessary evils, Machiavelli talks a lot about vices and virtues in The Prince, so essentially, very quickly, vices are bad things you do, virtues are good things you do. One of his main points, though, is that vices can become virtues and virtues can become vices. For instance, Robin Hood. Normally stealing is bad, but if you're stealing from the rich to give to the poor, that vice becomes a virtue through the context of its actions. So, in this case, doing the bad things that the prince advocates that you do are vices, certainly, like killing people is bad. But in the relevant context, that is trying to unite Italy and doing a good thing, that vice becomes a virtue. So Machiavelli builds in logic within his own analysis of princely activity to justify what is going on in the entirety of the work. So it's really quite clever because his own little philosophical discourse here becomes relevant to the mission, the goal of the book, which I think is absolutely brilliant. So even before the end of the book, Machiavelli is giving you little hints here and there that, hey, this may sound not so great, but give it a little bit, hear out the context, and then maybe you'll see it from a different angle. His other book, Discourses on Livy, is about, well, really, it in the name, Discourses on Livy. Livy, Roman historian, wrote about the Republic. His book is, from the founding of the Republic, and it chronicles all of Roman history, and Machiavelli's Discourses on Livy are, Livy says, and then in this year, this happened, and Machiavelli goes in and says, so, in this event, certain, psychological things are at play, certain historical things, factors are at play, and tries to unpack why the things in Livy happen the way they do. So, of course, he gets into tangents about human nature, about how politics work, militaries work, all sorts of really, really interesting things. It's a fantastic read. Really long, but worth it for sure. Especially if you have a background in Roman history like I do now, but I definitely did not then. What I do plan on doing is actually reading it again now that I actually know how Roman history works and thinking, oh my god, this entire chapter suddenly makes sense to me. When, they'd say the word, and yes, and then they had the second triumvirate, and I'm thinking, no idea what that is. Cool. When really now I can think, yes, that was Augustus Caesar and his buddy, whatever. So the point is that Discourses on Livy essentially is a fundamentally different book in subject matter and in perspective than The Prince is. So while they both use the same types of expositionary models where you would have Machiavelli saying, this is a thing I believe is true in human nature, and then cites an example from modern times and an example from the ancient times. He does that a lot in his works across whatever books he's writing. The fundamental distinction between the two is in Discourses on Livy, Machiavelli says republics are good, and in The Prince, Machiavelli says princes and more absolute power is good. So how can one guy write two different books that advocate completely different views, seemingly? Well, I'm going to explain that to you right now. So essentially, since, like I was saying earlier, Italy was essentially a mess, Machiavelli felt that definitely to unite Italy and get it onto a place where it could continue, it needed to be brought together by someone who could take the measures that no one else would take. And that person is the prince. So he's writing the prince as the first step to get Italy together, and then from that point, the prince would then let go of that power that he fought so desperately to gain and hold on to, so that a more moderate republic can take in and basically run things from there. It's the same thing that actually happened in a lot of occasions in Rome. So when Caesar, for instance, was out fighting Pompey, and then he won and came back, and all that other stuff happened that I won't get into right now, they made him dictator, for brief periods of time, so that he could basically run the state and keep everything under control, with the understanding that eventually they would give the power back to the Senate and the Tribune and all those other things, and go back to a more normal state of government. But in that emergency state, Caesar got emergency powers. So the prince is basically the guy who gets the emergency powers and puts everything back in order so that a republic can take over. And Machiavelli absolutely thinks that republics are better than principalities. He says it a lot. If you go into discourses on Livy, you can see how much he has a clear preference for republics over principalities. So you can additionally see how this is the case based on Machiavelli's historical context, why, even though he will advocate the benefits of both principalities and republics in different circumstances, he will ultimately prefer a republic as the kind of government that would stay in power for a long period of time, when really principalities are only necessary in very specific, extreme instances. So in Machiavelli's personal life, you see that he was serving somewhat begrudgingly with the Medici for a little while, but then when the Republic came around, he was absolutely committed to it, and he really does think, and you can see based on the way he lived his life and the governments that he devoted most of his energy to, that he was really on board with the Republic, and he wanted that to be the way that Florence in particular, but really Italy in general, ultimately was going to move forward. So you have some mixed messages going on, yes, between the two books, but with Discourses on Livy, you get a very clear message that he says republics are absolutely the way to go about. Now, The Prince by nature is a much more complicated book to unpack the meaning of, because whereas Discourses on Livy was simply written to represent Machiavelli's own ideas, The Prince was written to someone. It was written for the Medici guy, Lorenzo II, as, a way to give advice. So there's a lot of stuff going on in why the book was written, so you can look at it and unpack some of where the sarcasm lies, and you can see, oh, he's clearly just having a go at this guy, behind his back, and writing the little sarcastic quips into the book in the hope that the guy's too stupid to notice, which he was. But then if you really do sit down and take a look at it, you'll see, given the historical context, Machiavelli's actually being entirely serious in many places. So, one sentence about how Cesare Borgia was such a cunning leader because when he came to a town, he, blamed all of the problems that he was responsible for on someone else, and then killed that guy, made him take the fall. A, it's cruel, and it paints the Medici guy as cruel by comparing him to him, but also B, he's saying, when you need to really bring different, kingdoms, republics under one rule to unite them, that's some of the stuff you have to do, and it's a very bad reality, but it is a reality of how things work. So that hopefully enlightens some of the differences between the two works for you. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. So that is episode 2 of the Overly Sarcastic Podcast. I've realized that in addition to more in-depth analytical pieces on, certain books that we've covered, may not have covered before, this format is really, really conducive to talking about the books that aren't really stories, like what Red does, aren't really history, like what I do. So if you have any things that you'd like us to talk about on the Overly Sarcastic Podcast about, politics or philosophy or anything in the sort of like great booksy type thing that isn't really a story, anything of the sort, leave a comment. We'll try to get to it. Next time, probably going to talk about the formation of epic poetry and how that works, as I mentioned briefly last time. That should be fun. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed, as always, and I will see you in the next video.